Every mystery has a voice. Few dare to listen.
It was generally agreed in the village of Brackenhurst that Father Benedict Mallory had always been a little too fond of the theatrical, which, coming from parishioners who tolerated both the Women's Guild pageant and the annual harvest recital of dubious hymnody, was saying rather a great deal. Still, even his sternest critics admitted that the manner of his death, collapsed before the high altar with an expression of startled reproach, was excessively dramatic even for him. It was just after 8 o'clock on a Thursday morning when Lord Peter Wimsey, who had been staying at the neighbouring estate to catalogue a collection of 17th-century psalters for amusement, strolled up the church path in search of a bell tower that allegedly rang flat on its lower notes. He had intended only to investigate this tonal scandal, a crime far older and more vicious than any human wickedness, as he had cheerfully informed the baffled gardener, but instead found a small crowd gathered in the porch, clustered around Mrs. Dredge, the verger's wife, who was shedding tears with energetic piety. The constable, young Phipps, a man whose moustache appeared to have taken a solemn oath never to grow, straightened when he saw Wimsey approach. "Begging your pardon, my lord. Best not to enter. The Reverend Mallory's, indisposed." "Indisposed," Wimsey repeated, lifting an eyebrow. "That, my dear Phipps, is the term one applies to maiden ladies afflicted with excess devotion to weak tea. What you mean, I fancy, is that the late Father Mallory is exceedingly dead." Mrs. Dredge let out a fresh and gratifying wail. "He fell like a stone, my lord, right there before the candles. Mr. Bligh found him when he come in to light the tapers. Such a look on his face, like one of them gargoyles what stared down at you from the cathedral roof. Oh, it was unnatural." "At the risk of pricking your imagination, Mrs. Dredge," said Wimsey lightly, "most gargoyles are carved that way on purpose." Despite his flippancy, his eyes had sharpened. Wimsey looked past the constable through the open door and saw the dim interior, the long shadows thrown by the morning grey, the high altar hazy with incense residue, and, just visible beyond the choir rail, the sprawled shape of a man in black clericals. "What did the doctor say?" Wimsey asked quietly. Dr. Fenwick, a stooped and fussy gentleman who had the air of having been chronically disappointed since 1894, emerged from the chancel, wiping his spectacles. "Infarction, probably," he muttered, though without conviction. "Heart stopped. These clerical fellows are always overworked. Too many sermons, too much visiting, not enough liver." "Ah," said Wimsey, "but surely the Almighty would not choose a Thursday morning to strike down a hard-working vicar. Sundays are so much more economical." Dr. Fenwick glared. "If you want my professional opinion—" "My dear fellow," Wimsey interrupted, "I asked for nothing so presumptuous, merely inquiring." He stepped inside before the constable could object, his shoes tapping softly against the stone. The air was heavy with the cold scent of extinguished candles. Father Mallory lay half-turned, one arm flung across the marble step as though reaching for something, or someone. Wimsey knelt, not touching anything, merely observing. The priest's eyes were wide, his mouth slightly open as if caught mid-protest. A faint trace of ash clung to one sleeve. The altar cloth on the right corner hung askew, as if it had been tugged or brushed roughly. "Curious," Wimsey murmured. "What is, my lord?" asked Phipps, who had followed nervously. Wimsey gestured toward the great silver bell rope hanging near the vestry door. It swayed almost imperceptibly, as though it had been recently disturbed. "You called me here to consider the flattening of bells," Wimsey said, "and instead I find myself contemplating why the bell would be rung at 8 minutes past 7 for no scheduled service, and by whom." Phipps blinked. We thought that were just the wind, my lord." "At 8 minutes past 7, Wimsey repeated thoughtfully. "The wind in Brackenhurst must possess a most punctual character. A pity it cannot be persuaded to keep the church clock in similar discipline." He rose, brushing dust from his knees. His expression was mild, almost genial, but his eyes were alight with a quiet, analytical fire. "Well then," he said, "if Father Mallory has chosen this melodramatic method of departure, it seems only polite that someone inquire into the matter. It would not do, Phipps, to have a clergyman dying in his own church, especially if he did not die alone." Mrs. Dredge gasped. Fenwick froze midway through polishing his spectacles. Wimsey smiled faintly. "My dear people, please don't look so alarmed. I merely note that the good father appears to have spent his last minutes in the company of someone or something who has not yet signed the attendance book." And with that delicate quip, Lord Peter Wimsey turned toward the vestry, humming a snatch of Purcell, as if the morning had presented him with a diverting puzzle rather than the corpse of a priest. Phipps trailed after Wimsey with the hesitant tread of a man who feared both sacrilege and embarrassment in equal measure. The vestry door protested faintly as Wimsey pushed it open. The hinges, like most things in Brackenhurst, had been left to the mercies of time and inadequate oiling. Inside, the small room was as orderly as a devout matron's pantry. Surplices hung in obedient rows, smelling faintly of starch and lavender. A narrow desk bore the parish register, its inkpot still uncorked. Wimsey's gaze lingered on it. Not long, but long enough for Phipps to swallow audibly. "Odd," Wimsey murmured. "What is, my lord?" Phipps ventured, rather wishing he had, stayed by the porch. "Only that Father Mallory, who was famously pedantic about the sacredness of record-keeping, appears to have left his last entry half-finished." Wimsey pointed without touching. The page bore the neat, looping script characteristic of Mallory's hand. "Vespers attended by," and nothing further. The nib of the pen had scratched a slight blot beneath the unfinished sentence. "Begun last night, perhaps," Phipps said hopefully. "Perhaps," Wimsey agreed lightly. "Though I should imagine a man who starts a sentence on Wednesday evening generally finishes it before collapsing dead on Thursday morning. Unless, of course, he was interrupted by some urgent caller or unexpected conversation." Phipps shifted uncomfortably, his boots creaking. A soft noise drifted through the vestry window, the echo of hurried footsteps in the churchyard gravel. Wimsey crossed to the window and tilted his head. A young woman in a dark wool coat stood at the gate, clutching a small reticule so tightly her knuckles shone pale. She appeared undecided whether to enter or flee. "Ah," Wimsey said, "we seem to be receiving visitors." Before Phipps could object, Wimsey stepped briskly out of the vestry and through the nave to the porch. The young woman looked up sharply as he opened the door, her expression caught between relief and dread. "Miss?" Wimsey prompted gently. "Clara Bligh," she said, her voice hushed. "My father is the sacristan. Constable Phipps sent word. He said Father Mallory had died." Wimsey offered her his arm with courtly ease. "Come inside, Miss Bligh. I am sure your father could use your steadiness." She hesitated before taking the step. I'm not certain he wants to see me," she whispered. The remark, so slight and quietly spoken, struck Wimsey as unexpectedly significant. He tucked it away like a folded note. Inside, Mr. Bligh stood stiffly near the chancel rail, his face a pallid mask of duty and distress. He nodded curtly at his daughter, but did not approach her. The distance between them seemed to widen, thickening the air with unspoken sentiment. Wimsey let the moment settle, then cleared his throat. "Mr. Bligh, forgive the intrusion," he said amiably. "I'm told you discovered the vicar this morning. Might we trouble you to recount the order of events?" Bligh's Adam's apple bobbed once. "I came in at 7, as always, to lay out the vessels and light the candles for morning prayers. The church was cold, colder than usual. I noticed the altar cloth was crooked. I went up to straighten it, and that was when I saw him." "You rang the bell, I believe," Wimsey said mildly. Bligh started. "No, my lord. I never touched the rope." Phipps looked astonished. "But the bell went off at 7:08, sir. Half the village heard it." Bligh shook his head vehemently. "Not by my doing." Wimsey clasped his hands behind his back, rocking slightly on his heels. "Most intriguing. So the bell announced Father Mallory's demise, but apparently without human assistance, unless the wind has taken holy orders." Clara shifted, glancing nervously toward the belfry. "Father Mallory hated the bell rung at odd hours," she said quietly. "He used to say it disturbed the dead more than the living." "A cheerful sentiment," Wimsey murmured, "and perhaps an unintentional clue." Dr. Fenwick emerged from the chancel once more, bristling like a small affronted terrier. "If you are suggesting supernatural interference again, Lord Peter, I must insist—" "My dear doctor," Wimsey interrupted, "I never suggest the supernatural. I merely observe human nature expressing itself through peculiar habits. In this case, a bell." He turned back to Bligh. "Tell me, when you entered the church, were the side doors bolted?" "Yes, my lord, all as usual." "And the windows?" "Closed. I checked the latches myself." Wimsey nodded, filing each detail carefully into the unseen compartments of his mind. The church had been sealed, yet something, or someone, had rung the bell between Bligh's arrival and the discovery of the body. Clara's voice trembled ever so slightly. "Father Mallory wasn't well yesterday. He seemed troubled." "Troubled," Wimsey repeated. "In what fashion?" She hesitated, glancing at her father, then lowered her voice. "He asked me to bring him the spare altar keys after choir practice. Said he'd misplaced his own, but when I returned with them, the vestry door was shut, and I heard him speaking with someone." "Someone?" Wimsey leaned forward. "A man," she said. "I didn't recognize the voice. Low, urgent, angry, perhaps." Bligh stiffened. "Clara, why did you not tell me this?" "You were already cross with me yesterday," she murmured. Wimsey, sensing a familial tempest brewing, interceded smoothly. "Miss Bligh, this is extremely helpful. At what hour was this conversation overheard?" "Just before 9, she said. "I remember because the lamps were being extinguished in the nave." "Very good," Wimsey said. His tone was soft enough to soothe, but his eyes gleamed with interest. "Then we must discover who visited Father Mallory last night, and whether that same gentleman found reason to return." He turned to Phipps. "Constable, I suggest we begin with the parish registers, visitors' logs, and any correspondence delivered yesterday. Have them brought to the vicarage, if you please." Phipps saluted awkwardly. "Right away, my lord." "And Mr. Bligh," Wimsey added, "you might accompany me there. I should like to know precisely what the vicar misplaced, and what he may have found before he died." Bligh swallowed again, but nodded. As they stepped out into the churchyard, the morning fog had thickened into a pale, curling veil around the gravestones. Wimsey paused for a fleeting moment, gazing up at the bell tower, where the rope still swayed faintly, though no breeze touched the air. "A bell that rings itself," he murmured. "A priest who dies with eyes wide open, and a visitor none will name." He smiled, the sort of smile that meant he had scented not merely a mystery, but a beautifully tangled one. "Come, gentlemen, the day is young, and the dead, if we may trust Father Mallory, are already disturbed enough." Wimsey walked with an easy stride across the churchyard, Mr. Bligh following with the stiff gait of a man who would rather be anywhere else than in the company of aristocratic detectives and disquieting mysteries. The fog had softened into a pale, luminous haze, filtering the morning light so that the vicarage, a modest Georgian structure of honey-colored stone, appeared faintly insubstantial, as though it, too, were uncertain what secrets it contained. Inside, the vicarage hall smelled faintly of old sermons, beeswax polish, and the lingering austerity of a clergyman who kept everything neat except his own conscience. Bligh removed his hat and held it before him with both hands. "The study is this way, my lord," he murmured. though Wimsey already seemed to know, as though guided by instinct or architectural inevitability. The study door stood ajar. Wimsey nudged it open with one finger and stepped inside. If the man's church had been orderly, the study was its chaotic twin. Books lay in garrisons along the floor as though they had rebelled against shelving. Papers sprawled across the desk in layers that spoke of months, perhaps years, of half-finished thoughts. A coal fire smoldered in the grate, barely attended. A kettle rested beside it, as if waiting for a tea that would never be poured. Bligh made a disapproving noise low in his throat. The Reverend was a scholarly man, my lord, but he did tend to scatter things. Scholars, Wimsey remarked, are nature's magpies. They hoard scraps and glittering oddments, convinced that someday one of them will prove essential. Occasionally, very occasionally, they are right. He drifted toward the desk, hands clasped behind his back, careful not to disturb anything. He read fragments of letters without touching them. His eyes flicked lightly across a set of financial statements, a parish calendar, a sermon draft titled The Saints and Their Trials. Then, quietly, "Mr. Bligh, would you be so good as to tell me what Father Mallory claimed to have lost?" Bligh seemed to brace himself. "His altar keys, my lord. He'd misplaced them on Wednesday afternoon. He said he would search here in the study before asking me for the spares." "And did he find them?" "I could not say. He never mentioned them again." "Curious," Wimsey murmured. "A man devoted to routine loses the one item he guards daily. One wonders whether the keys were mislaid or taken." Before Bligh could answer, the faint groan of the front gate reached them. Footsteps approached, hurried, purposeful. Wimsey's head lifted, fox-like, and moments later, Phipps appeared in the doorway, breathless, his moustache quivering with the effort of running. "My lord, I've brought what you asked. The parish logs, yesterday's post, and the visitor's register. Mrs. Dredge says the morning post hadn't yet been sorted." "Excellent," Wimsey said, accepting nothing but motioning Phipps to deposit the bundle on the nearest chair. "Let us see whether the Reverend's final hours left their imprint on paper." Phipps stepped back, wiping his brow with the back of his sleeve. Wimsey began with the visitor's register, leaning over it with the mild, scholarly air of a man reading an antiquarian catalogue. Bligh and Phipps watched in silence as he traced the previous day's entries. "Mrs. Craythorne at 10, Wimsey murmured. "The flower rota, no doubt. Mr. Longley at noon. The organ tuner, excellent fellow, always slightly deaf to criticism. And here we are." His finger paused at the final entry. "R. Fenley, 6:45 p.m. Signed in a bold, impatient hand." Phipps frowned. "Fenley, don't know the name." Bligh did. His voice dropped half a register. "Mr. Roderick Fenley, sir. Father Mallory's childhood friend. They were close once, they say. But he lives in Eastbourne now. Hardly ever comes to Brackenhurst." Wimsey's expression brightened with the faintest glimmer of amusement. A reunion after many years, arriving precisely an hour and a quarter before Miss Bligh heard the vicar conversing with an unidentified gentleman. How very obliging of the past to stroll into the present at such convenient moments. He lifted the visitor's book, still without touching the ink, and angled it toward the light. The signature is fresh, damp on the upstroke. He signed in a hurry. Bligh cleared his throat. "I recall seeing a motor car by the gate around that time. A dark one, but I didn't recognize it." "You seldom do, Mr. Bligh," Wimsey said kindly. "It is one of your more endearing qualities." He set the register down and turned to the letters. Most were of the harmless, bureaucratic kind. Diocesan updates, charity notices, a parishioner complaining about drafty pews. But one envelope, slightly crumpled, bore no return address. Wimsey lifted it delicately by the edges. "Phipps, would you be so good as to unfold that sheet of blotting paper by the window? No fingerprints, if you please. We must not smudge the good doctor's theories." Phipps complied, looking pleased to be entrusted with a task requiring delicacy. Wimsey tipped the contents of the envelope onto the blotting paper. A single sheet of paper slid out, folded once. Bly inhaled sharply. Wimsey read it in silence. His eyebrows lifted, but he said nothing at first. The handwriting was fierce, angular, unmistakably incensed. "We must speak tonight. I will not have this matter postponed any longer. You know what you owe, Benedict. You know what you promised. R.F." "R.F.," Phipps repeated. "Roderick Fenley." "One assumes so," Wimsey said cheerfully, "unless Brackenhurst boasts another gentleman with those initials who writes threatening letters to clergymen." Bly's voice shook. "Oh, promised. I knew they had quarrelled years ago, but—" Wimsey folded the letter once more and set it back on the blotting paper. His tone lightened, though his gaze remained sharply focused. "My dear Mr. Bly, rectories and vicarages are always full of old ghosts. Some are metaphorical, some merely arrive late." He looked thoughtfully toward the window, where the fog had begun to thin. "I think, Phipps, we must speak with Mr. Fenley, immediately. For the man who writes an ultimatum tends to keep his appointments, and if Miss Bly heard voices at 9 o'clock... He let the implication drift into the quiet room, charged and heavy. Then, softly, "It is possible Father Mallory kept 2 appointments on his last night. One written, one unwritten, and one of them, I fancy, did not end well." The vicarage door had scarcely closed behind them when Wimsey set off at a brisk pace toward the lane, coat swinging lightly and mind evidently several paces ahead of his feet. Phipps trotted beside him with the sturdy anxiety of a man attempting to keep pace with both detective and deduction. Mr. Bly followed more slowly, like a figure reluctantly tethered to events he wished he could decline. "Fenley still keeps a house in Brackenhurst, doesn't he?" Wimsey asked without turning his head. Bly nodded, catching up. "A small cottage on the north end, near the mill. He inherited it from his aunt, but comes only rarely." "And last night," Wimsey mused, "he came very rarely indeed, between 6:45 and, by Miss Bly's account, 9 o'clock. A rather extended visit for 2 men who had not met in some years." Phipps puffed. "Think they quarrelled, my lord?" "I should be astonished if they had not," Wimsey replied. "Friendships that lie dormant for decades seldom reawaken with gentle pleasantries. The letter suggests something long owed. Long-owed matters have a most disagreeable habit of becoming explosive when finally discussed." Bly's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Wimsey tossed him a small, sympathetic glance. They reached the north end of the village in a few minutes, the fog retreating into ragged shreds that clung to hedgerows like forgotten veils. Fenley's cottage appeared suddenly through the thinning mist, a square, crouched little dwelling with ivy dragging possessively down its walls. Phipps rapped at the door with unnecessary firmness, and moments later a man of about 50 answered. His hair, graying at the temples, was combed with meticulous precision. His suit was well tailored, but his expression bore the strained politeness of someone trying to keep a great many emotions from bursting at once. "Mr. Roderick Fenley?" Wimsey asked pleasantly. Fenley's eyes narrowed. "Yes. And you are?" "Wimsey," he said, offering a faint bow. "Lord Peter Wimsey. You may have heard of me. I've been known to bother criminals and bore innocent citizens in comparatively equal measure." Fenley blinked, uncertain whether to take offense. "What do you want?" "Just a small matter regarding Father Mallory," Wimsey replied. "I understand you visited him yesterday evening." A flicker, barely perceptible, crossed Fenley's face. Surprise, irritation, or perhaps regret. He stepped aside stiffly. "Come in." The interior of the cottage was neat, almost ascetically so. Nothing was out of place. Nothing gave the impression of warmth. It was a home curated, not lived in. "I don't know what you've heard," Fenley said tightly, "but Benedict and I spoke privately. There's no reason to involve the police." Phipps bristled. "It involves them now, sir. Father Mallory is dead." Fenley froze. Completely. Not even a blink. "Dead?" he whispered. "But no, that's impossible. He was alive when I left him." Wimsey said nothing, simply watched him with the steady, almost kind gaze of a man accustomed to observing truth by merely waiting for it to wriggle into view. Fenley sank into a chair, visibly shaken. "What happened?" "We shall come to that," Wimsey said gently. "First, Mr. Fenley, we should like a very clear account of your visit. You signed the parish register at 6:45. Fenley rubbed his hands together, perhaps to steady himself. "Yes. I went to confront him. Something long past. He had avoided the subject for years. And last night he could avoid it no longer," Wimsey added softly. Fenley closed his eyes briefly. "He owed me money, a considerable amount, an old debt. I thought he would finally make it right." "That," Wimsey said thoughtfully, "is a motive for anger, though not necessarily for murder. Pray continue." Fenley straightened, his voice growing more defensive. "We argued, yes, but he insisted he had nothing left to give, that the church stipends barely supported him, that any inheritance he had once possessed was gone. It ended badly. I left around 8. "8 precisely?" Wimsey asked. "I didn't look at the clock," Fenley admitted. "But near enough. Did you see anyone on your way out?" "No." "And did Father Mallory appear unsettled?" Fenley hesitated. "He was angry. But no, something was wrong with him. He kept glancing at the vestry door as though expecting someone else. At one point he asked me, not unkindly, to leave quickly." Phipps frowned. "Why would he do that?" "Because," Wimsey answered for him, "he had another appointment." Fenley stiffened again. "Another? With whom?" "That," Wimsey said, mildly, "is precisely what we are trying to determine." Fenley swallowed. Wimsey continued. "One more question, Mr. Fenley. When you left the church, did you hear the bell ring?" "Ring?" Fenley looked bewildered. "No, why would it?" "It rang at 7:08, Wimsey said. "Unscheduled, unattended, and yet rung." Fenley's pallor deepened. "I heard nothing." Wimsey regarded him carefully, weighing each word, each tremor. When Fenley's gaze dropped, Wimsey rose. "Thank you, Mr. Fenley. We shall disturb you no longer, unless, of course, we must." Fenley did not follow them to the door. He remained seated, staring into some private torment. Outside, Phipps exhaled sharply. "Well, that clears him, I suppose." Wimsey smiled faintly. "My dear Phipps, innocence rarely declares itself through vehement denial, nor does guilt proclaim itself by trembling hands. We have only verifiable facts, and they are few. Fenley left by 8, or so he says. The bell rang at 7:08. Father Mallory spoke with someone around 9. Bly shuddered. "Then who?" "That is our next pursuit," Wimsey said lightly. "For if Fenley's appointment ended at 8, and Mallory's death occurred sometime between then and dawn, there remains one window of time, one conversation we must illuminate." He turned, eyes gleaming with quiet triumph. "The unknown visitor at 9 o'clock, Miss Bly heard him. And I suspect," he added, lowering his voice, "that the person she heard did not enter by the front door at all." Phipps blinked, but the church was locked. "Indeed," Wimsey agreed pleasantly, "which makes the matter so very interesting. A locked church, a ringing bell, a second voice behind a closed vestry door." He paused in the lane, the fog lifting entirely now, leaving the world clear and cold. "Come, gentlemen. It is time," he said, "to speak with Clara Bly again, and to ask her precisely what it was she heard." The air inside the manor seemed to tighten as Miss Marple paused at the foot of the staircase, her gaze traveling slowly upward as if the shadowed steps themselves were whispering truths long concealed. The faint scent of lavender polish lingered in the air, mingling with something sharper, an unease that had begun to settle over everyone in the house. Without hurrying, she lifted her eyes toward the landing where the late Lady Bantry had last been seen alive. Colonel Melrose followed her line of sight. "You think something happened here?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady, though he already sensed her answer. Miss Marple nodded gently. "I think this house is trying very hard to tell us what everyone else will not." Her fingertips brushed along the handrail. "This polish is fresh, too fresh. Someone cleaned something, far too meticulously, after the body was discovered." Melrose stiffened. "You think the scene was tampered with?" "I think," she replied softly, "that someone hoped to hide a mistake." At that moment, footsteps echoed from the hallway behind them. It was Diana, one of the maids, eyes red, hands trembling as she clutched a feather duster to her chest like a shield. She stopped abruptly when she saw the two of them staring up the stairs. "Miss Marple, Colonel," she stammered, "I didn't expect— Well, I thought you were in the drawing room." Miss Marple turned to her with that same kind, disarming gentleness that made even the most guarded souls falter. "My dear, could you tell us who was asked to clean the staircase yesterday morning?" Diana swallowed hard. We all take turns," she said, but her voice cracked on the last word. "But yesterday, Mrs. Hargreaves told us not to touch anything. She said the police wanted everything left exactly as it was." Miss Marple exchanged a quiet glance with Melrose. "And did everyone obey?" The maid hesitated. A silence stretched between them. Then Diana's shoulders slumped. "No," she whispered. "Someone went up anyway, early, very early, before any of us were up. I heard them. Light steps, a quick movement, and then the sound of the bucket being set down. I didn't see their face, I swear it, but you know who it was," Miss Marple finished gently. Diana pressed her lips together as tears brimmed. "I think it was Rebecca." Melrose stiffened. Rebecca, the personal maid who had served Lady Bantry for nearly a decade, known for her precision, her loyalty, her silence. Miss Marple nodded, not with triumph, but with a soft melancholy. "And where might we find her now?" "She went outside," Diana said, "toward the orchard. She said she needed air." "Air," Melrose repeated grimly. "Or time to think of her next move." Miss Marple placed a hand lightly on his arm. "Let us not alarm her. If Rebecca knows something, we must encourage her to speak freely, not drive her deeper into fear." The colonel nodded and stepped back, letting Miss Marple lead the way toward the garden door. The sky outside had dimmed, a soft grey light falling over the orchard like a veil. The branches trembled in the breeze, casting restless shadows along the ground. Near the far trees, a solitary figure stood with her back to them, still tense, gripping her apron with white knuckles. Rebecca. Miss Marple approached her with the gentlest cadence, each step unthreatening. "My dear," she said quietly, "you've carried a very heavy burden these last hours, haven't you?" Rebecca turned sharply. Her eyes were rimmed with panic, and in them lay a truth she had been struggling not to reveal. "I didn't hurt her," she whispered before Miss Marple had even posed a question. "I loved her. She was good to me." "I know," Miss Marple replied. "But you cleaned the stairs after the discovery, didn't you?" Rebecca's breath hitched, her composure cracking. "I had to. I couldn't let them find it. Not like that." Melrose stepped closer. "Find what?" Rebecca looked between them, fear, guilt, and something deeper warring in her expression. Her hands trembled violently as she clasped them at her chest. "There was blood," she whispered. "A smear, leading up the last 3 steps. It wasn't supposed to be there. She never should have gone up alone. She promised she wouldn't." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "She promised? Promised whom?" Rebecca opened her mouth, but before the words could form, a sharp crack echoed through the orchard, branches snapping under hurried footsteps. Someone else was watching, someone who had followed them, and they were running. Rebecca flinched at the sound, her gaze snapping toward the far end of the orchard where the branches still trembled from the disturbance. Colonel Melrose stepped instinctively in front of her, his hand drifting toward his coat pocket where his revolver usually rested during official inquiries. Miss Marple, however, remained perfectly still, her eyes narrowing with a quiet intensity. "That was not the wind," she murmured. "Someone has been listening far more closely than they should." Melrose took a cautious step forward. "Stay here," he instructed Rebecca, though she clung to her apron as if it were the only thing anchoring her to the earth. But Miss Marple moved before he could advance further, her steps slow but purposeful as she followed the line of disturbed branches. "Colonel, if you rush," she said calmly, "you will startle them. And frightened people do foolish things, far more foolish than they intend." Melrose exhaled sharply but obeyed, adjusting his pace to match hers. Together they moved through the orchard until the canopy thinned and the narrow footpath emerged. A faint scuff in the dirt, fresh, marked the direction someone had fled toward the hedge bordering the estate. Miss Marple crouched slightly, fingertips hovering just above the ground. "The stride is short," she said softly. "And hurried, yes, but not the stride of a strong man, nor even a particularly athletic woman. Someone small, someone trying not to be seen but unable to remain quiet." Melrose frowned. "One of the servants?" "Perhaps," she replied, "or someone pretending to be one." Behind them, Rebecca let out a shuddering breath. "Please," she said, stepping forward. "I didn't mean to cause trouble. But Lady Bantry, she wasn't supposed to go upstairs alone that night. She promised me she wouldn't. She said she only wanted a word with him, and then—" Miss Marple straightened sharply. "Him?" Rebecca froze, realizing her slip too late. Melrose turned fully toward her. Who was she meeting? Tears welled again. Her voice trembled, torn between loyalty and fear. "I can't. He said if anyone knew, if anyone even suspected—" Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on her arm. "My dear child, Lady Bantry is dead. Whatever she meant to protect is gone with her, but the truth must remain. Who was the man she went to meet?" Rebecca closed her eyes, breathing unevenly. "It was Mr. Ashton, the estate manager." A chill moved through Melrose. "Ashton? But he claimed he was nowhere near the main house that night." "He lied," Rebecca whispered. "She asked him to come. They argued, quiet but tense. I heard them. Then she went up the stairs alone, and he followed a few minutes later." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Followed? After she asked him to leave?" "Yes," Rebecca said. She sounded upset. She told him, "This cannot continue." And he said she didn't understand the risk. The orchard seemed to still around them, the weight of the revelation thick in the air. Miss Marple took a slow breath. "Colonel, the listener in the trees. If they fled just now, it may well have been someone who knew what Rebecca was about to confess." Melrose's expression hardened. "Ashton." Miss Marple did not answer directly, but her silence carried the truth. Melrose turned toward the hedge. "If he's running, he's not running away," Miss Marple interrupted calmly. "Not yet. He's running to hide something, or to silence someone." At that moment, a second sound drifted through the orchard, a faint metallic clatter from near the potting shed beyond the hedge. Not hurried footsteps, not panic. Something far more deliberate. Miss Marple's voice lowered. "He is not fleeing. He is preparing." Melrose's hand tightened around his pocket. "Preparing for what?" Miss Marple's expression grew solemn, her eyes reflecting a truth she had already pieced together. "For the moment," she said quietly, "when he no longer intends to run at all." Melrose did not wait for further elaboration. With a curt nod, he pushed through the gap in the hedge, its thorns catching his sleeve as though nature itself wished to hinder his progress. Miss Marple followed at her steady, measured pace, not rushed, but with the certainty of someone who knew precisely where the next revelation waited to unfold. Rebecca, left trembling behind them, pressed her hands to her mouth as though to keep in a cry that might shatter whatever fragile safety remained. The potting shed lay a short distance beyond the hedge, its wooden walls worn grey by seasons of wind and damp. A single grimy window glowed faintly from within. No lamp, merely reflected daylight, but enough to show the silhouette of a man bending over a workbench. Melrose slowed at once, raising a hand to halt Miss Marple behind him. "He's in there," he whispered, though the gesture of silence was unnecessary. Miss Marple had already fixed her attention on the narrow gap beneath the door where a wisp of dust still stirred. Recent movement, calculated movement. She leaned toward Melrose with a quiet breath. "Be very careful. A cornered man with too much to lose may decide that violence is the only remaining logic available to him." Melrose gave a grim nod. "You think he means to destroy evidence?" "I think," she replied evenly, "that he means to decide his future before we decide it for him." He reached for the shed door, but Miss Marple raised one thin hand. "No sudden entries, Colonel. Men like Mr. Ashton are steadied by their own illusions. If we break them too abruptly, they might splinter." Melrose hesitated, then rapped sharply on the door. "Ashton, this is Colonel Melrose. I require a word." Inside, the silhouette stilled. There was a pause, too long for innocence, too short for genuine surprise. Then the man straightened, though he did not turn toward the door. His voice, when it emerged, carried the brittle calm of someone performing steadiness rather than feeling it. "Colonel, I wasn't expecting visitors." Miss Marple's expression grew sharper at the slight catch in the final word, a faint inhalation that betrayed the fear he sought to mask. Melrose tried the handle. Locked. "Ashton," he said with controlled authority, "open the door." Nothing. Then a faint scrape of metal against metal, unmistakable. Miss Marple took an almost imperceptible step forward. "He is putting something away," she murmured. "Something he hopes we shall not see." Melrose's patience snapped like a dry stick. "Ashton, enough of this. Open the door, or I'll break it down." A beat of silence followed, then the bolt slid back with deliberate slowness. The door creaked open half an inch, just enough for Melrose to push his way inside. Ashton stood beside the workbench, his face pale, his hands specked with the fine dust of soil and rotted wood. His eyes darted between them, calculating angles of escape and their likelihood of success. None appeared to comfort him. Miss Marple's gaze, however, did not fix on Ashton at all, but on the bench itself. A length of rope lay coiled, too neatly. It had been handled recently. Beside it sat a small tin of oil used for hinges and locks, and near the corner, barely concealed beneath a cracked flower pot, protruded the gleam of a metal latch, identical to the ones used on the upper landing windows of the main house. Melrose saw it a moment later. "What the devil is that doing here?" Ashton swallowed. "Old fittings, sir. Father Mallory ordered them replaced months ago." "Curious," Miss Marple said gently, "that such an old fitting appears wholly untouched by rust, and even more curious that it matches the one missing from Lady Bantry's window." Ashton's jaw clenched. Melrose stepped forward. "Explain yourself." Ashton drew a sharp breath. His eyes flicked to the rope, then the door, then the small window behind him, as if every option presented itself at once and all failed him equally. "It was never meant to happen," he whispered. "She wasn't supposed to fall. She said she'd tell the truth. She said she couldn't keep protecting him any longer." Melrose stiffened. "Protecting whom?" Ashton's gaze flared with a panic so stark it bordered on terror. "I can't. I promised. I've already said too much." Before Melrose could step closer, Ashton swung toward the rear window, his hand shooting out as if to unlatch it. But Miss Marple spoke then, her voice firm as a struck bell. "Stop!" He did. Completely. Her eyes held him like a wire drawn tight. "Running will not save you. It will only confirm the very worst interpretation of your actions. If you mean to protect the living as you believe you protected the dead, you must begin by telling the truth." Ashton's breath came fast and shallow. Melrose moved quietly to block the window. For a long moment, Ashton stood trembling, his fingers still hovering near the latch. Then slowly, painfully, he lowered his hand. "She wasn't protecting me," he said hoarsely. "She was protecting someone far more dangerous." Melrose exchanged a sharp look with Miss Marple. "Who?" he demanded. Ashton closed his eyes. "The person," he whispered, "who killed Father Mallory." And as he said it, Miss Marple's expression changed. Not with surprise, but with the solemn acknowledgement of something she had suspected for far longer than she had let on. The silence that followed Ashton's confession settled thickly over the potting shed, as though even the dust motes hesitated before drifting further. Melrose stood rigid, his hand still near his pocket, though force was no longer necessary. Ashton had collapsed inward, the last of his defiance expiring like a candle in an empty room. Miss Marple, however, watched him with a scrutiny that was neither unkind nor forgiving, merely exact. "You will need to be clearer," she said gently, the softness of her tone at odds with the precision of her intent. "Not for our benefit, Mr. Ashton, but for your own. You have skirted around the truth for too long, and half-truths are poor shields." Ashton's breath trembled, but he nodded. "I didn't kill Father Mallory, but I knew afterward. I saw something I shouldn't have seen, and Lady Bantry, she discovered it too." Melrose leaned forward. "What exactly did you see?" Ashton closed his eyes, summoning the memory like a reluctant man drawing up a corpse from the deep. Father Mallory had been troubled for days before his death. He was meeting someone in secret, late at night, behind the vestry garden. I wasn't meant to know, but I'd noticed the light moving across the vicarage lawn. A lantern, discreet, but not enough to hide the fact that someone visited him regularly after dark. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. A rendezvous at the vestry, not at the house. "Father Mallory didn't want the servants to know," Ashton whispered. "Or his sister." Melrose frowned. "And you followed him?" "I did." He swallowed. "Not out of malice. I feared he was being blackmailed. He'd grown nervous, jumpy even. And one night I saw the figure he met." He paused, and the stillness around him deepened. "Who was it, Ashton?" Melrose pressed. "A woman," Ashton said quietly. "Dressed plainly, but with a veil, and the way they spoke, it was urgent, not angry, but strained. She kept saying, 'You must tell her. She deserves to know.' And he kept replying that it was impossible." Miss Marple's breath came as the faintest stir, almost a sigh. "Impossible," she repeated, a very dangerous word between two people who share a secret. Ashton opened his eyes at last and looked at her. "I didn't know who she was then, not until much later, after Lady Bantry died. She had gone upstairs to confront Father Mallory about the same matter. And when she fell, when he found her, he panicked because she had learned the truth he'd hidden for 20 years. Melrose stiffened. 20 years. Ashton nodded. "A child, Colonel. A child Father Mallory had taken in, unofficially, adopted, though not by the church. A child whose parentage was complicated." Miss Marple grew very still, her thoughts turning visibly behind her eyes. "Complicated in what way?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the nature of the complication. Ashton's shoulders sagged. He told the woman that revealing the truth would ruin 2 families, and she insisted he had no right to conceal it, that the child, now grown, was owed the truth at any cost. Melrose exchanged a swift look with Miss Marple. "You're telling us Father Mallory had an illegitimate child?" "No," Ashton said, shaking his head with sudden vehemence. "Not his. He wasn't the father. He was the protector. The secret was someone else's." Miss Marple's gaze deepened, turning inward. "And that," she murmured, "is why Lady Bantry confronted him. She believed the secret was tied to the Bantry family." Ashton nodded miserably. She did, and she was right. The shed seemed to contract, as though the wooden boards themselves leaned closer to hear. Melrose's voice dropped to a low growl. "Then who? Who was the parent?" Ashton hesitated, and his glance darted, almost involuntarily, toward the latch he'd hidden beneath the flower pot. It was not merely evidence of a struggle. It was part of something larger, something calculated. Miss Marple noticed, of course. Her eyes flicked from the latch to Ashton's face and back again. "You are not protecting the child," she said quietly, "nor the woman in the veil. You are protecting the other parent, the living parent." Ashton's throat worked once, twice. Finally, the words broke out in a whisper that seemed torn from him. "The parent is someone in this house?" Melrose inhaled sharply. Miss Marple, however, did not flinch. Her expression was sorrowfully unsurprised. "And you fear," she said almost tenderly, "that revealing the parent will condemn them as Father Mallory's true murderer." Ashton's eyes widened. Confirmation enough. Miss Marple folded her hands. "But what you fail to understand, Mr. Ashton," she said softly, "is that the truth, once hidden this long, is already doing far more damage in the dark than it ever could in the light." Ashton's face crumpled. And at that precise moment, from somewhere near the vicarage path, the bell tower gave a low, uneasy toll, one that should not have sounded at that hour. Miss Marple turned her head sharply, her voice hushed yet certain. "That," she said, "is no accident. Someone has just set the next part of their plan in motion." The bell's unnatural toll carried across the estate with a hollow resonance, neither loud nor hurried, but deliberate, like a signal exchanged between conspirators who no longer needed to speak aloud. Melrose turned instinctively toward the sound, his posture taut as a wire, but Miss Marple did not move. She listened. She always listened first. "A single toll at this hour," she murmured, "has only one meaning in a parish with orderly habits." Ashton's face drained of what little color remained. The bell rope shouldn't even be reachable," he stammered. "It was taken down for repair after Father Mallory." Miss Marple gave a soft, grim nod. "Precisely." Melrose's patience fractured. "For heaven's sake, Miss Marple, what does it signify?" "Someone has entered the belfry," she replied, "despite it being locked. Or rather, they wish us to believe they have. Either way, Colonel, they are attempting to direct our attention. And when murderers begin to direct, it is because they fear the investigation is drifting too close." She turned her head toward Ashton, who flinched under her gaze. "There is more you have not told us. Something quite immediate. Something you fear will implicate the wrong person." Ashton swallowed hard, then reached out and steadied himself against the workbench, as though the truth itself threatened to unseat him. I thought if I removed the window latch and hid it," he said shakily, "they would think it had simply broken. That Lady Bantry's fall would look like an accident. I never meant to mislead you entirely, but if the truth came out, the other parent would be ruined. And I thought, God help me, I thought Father Mallory's death might have been punishment enough." Melrose stared at him. "You believed the killer had already claimed their first victim?" "Yes," Ashton whispered. "But now I see. I was terribly wrong." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. not in anger, but in the sorrow of a woman accustomed to watching human frailty play itself out like a tragic domestic routine. Whoever killed Father Mallory, she said softly, did so not out of panic, but out of control. They are not finished. The bell is not a flourish. It is a reminder that they can move through this parish unobserved, manipulating locks, ropes, and narratives at will. They want us to chase shadows while they attend to the next task. Melrose's jaw clenched. And what task is that? To silence the one person left who knows the entire truth, Miss Marple said simply. Ashton inhaled sharply. No, she told me she wouldn't speak. She promised she wouldn't. She only wanted to warn him. Her vows may have held yesterday, Miss Marple replied. But after Lady Bantry's death, and now with the investigation tightening, she may have realized that silence protects no one, and the killer knows this. Melrose blinked. You mean, the woman in the veil, Miss Marple said. She's still here, Colonel, in the village, watching, hiding, and if the killer fears she intends to reveal the truth, she's next, Melrose finished grimly. A sudden gust rattled the shed window. Ashton jumped, his nerves wound tight as wire. Miss Marple walked to the door, pausing only long enough to glance at the upper hinge, the scratches around the lock, the faint trace of boot polish smudged near the threshold. Time is short, she murmured. Melrose followed, but she lifted a hand to halt him. We must be very careful, Colonel, she said in a low voice. The killer is no longer concealing their actions. That means they are close, very close, and desperate people do not improvise. They execute whatever plan they cherished from the beginning. She stepped out into the orchard, her footsteps soft but unhesitating. And I fear, she added gently, that plan involves convincing us of the guilt of entirely the wrong person. Melrose exhaled sharply. Ashton. No, Miss Marple replied without turning. Mr. Ashton is a coward, not a killer, and cowards rarely climb bell towers. As they moved swiftly toward the path leading to the church, the distant sound of the bell rope brushing wood echoed again. Faint, almost hesitant. Miss Marple did not look back. The killer, she said, has gone to meet the woman in the veil. And if they reach her first, Melrose muttered, we may have another death on our hands. No, Miss Marple corrected him with a chilling calm. If they reach her first, Colonel, we will have the final piece of their design. The wind shifted, carrying the unmistakable sound of footsteps, quick, purposeful on the gravel path ahead. Miss Marple's voice lowered into a whisper. And that, she said, is precisely what they want us to misunderstand. The gravel crunched sharply beneath hurried footsteps, and Miss Marple halted, raising one gloved hand. Melrose almost collided with her, his impatience barely restrained, but she simply tilted her head toward the shadowed line of hedges that framed the churchyard. The figure ahead moved deliberately, yet with a tremor of uncertainty betraying haste under the guise of purpose. There, she whispered. Notice how the steps falter only near the uneven ground, someone consciously masking their presence, not fleeing instinctively. The killer, if it is they, is calculating each move even now. Melrose drew a sharp breath. And the woman in the veil. Miss Marple's eyes, grey and piercing even in the dim light, did not leave the figure's retreating form. She is ahead, concealed by the shadow of the sacristy wall, and she has something the murderer wants. The final witness, the living thread connecting all secrets. A sudden movement betrayed her. Her skirts rustled as she stepped lightly, almost imperceptibly into the open. The figure on the path froze, instinctively turning. A gasp, half fright, half recognition, escaped the woman. Miss Marple smiled faintly, but there was no warmth in it. Ah, Clara, she murmured under her breath. You were very wise to linger in the shadows, and yet wisdom alone does not grant safety. The figure ahead, now unmistakably revealed as the veiled woman, raised a hand as if to shield herself, but her voice broke in fear and frustration. You must stop him. You don't understand. He will do anything." A new presence emerged from behind the church. The murderer had misjudged the quiet of the hour. Ashton's earlier panic was nothing compared to the deliberate, measured stride of the man advancing now. A tall figure in a dark coat, face obscured by the lowering sun and shadow. Miss Marple stepped forward, calm and unhurried, as if greeting a long-expected guest. "Good evening, Mr. Hargreaves," she said, voice carrying that subtle authority that bends the will without raising it. "I believe you have a confession to make." The man froze mid-step, startled at her composure. "You don't know what—" "Oh, but I do," Miss Marple interrupted, her grey eyes narrowing. "You thought the bell would distract us, that the orchard's shadows would shield your movements, and that the discovery of Lady Bantry's fall would divert suspicion from yourself. Clever in a juvenile way, but insufficient." Melrose's revolver came up, though his hands trembled with tension. "Step aside," he barked. "Don't move another inch." Hargreaves lifted his hands, slowly, a faint smirk curling his lips. "You think it's that simple, Miss Marple?" "It is," she said gently, "if one remembers that murder is rarely a matter of strength, only of errors and oversight. You forgot the soundproofed vestry door, the unremoved latch, and the one servant who heard your conversation when you thought the world was asleep. You also misjudged the resolve of the woman you intended to frighten, and, I might add, the patience of those who watch quietly from the sidelines." The veiled woman stepped forward, gathering courage. "Yes," she said, voice trembling but firm. "I heard him. I know what he did." Hargreaves' face twisted, the first cracks in his carefully constructed mask appearing. "You— witness?" Miss Marple inclined her head ever so slightly. "And now you are caught by the weight of your own choices. Every lock you manipulated, every window you opened, every calculated delay, revealed by small inconsistencies and ultimately by human observation." Hargreaves's smirk faltered. He glared at the veiled woman, then at Ashton, who had silently followed and now held his breath, knowing the unmasking was imminent. Hargreaves began, faltering. "I never meant—" "She wasn't supposed to—" "She wasn't supposed to confront you," Miss Marple said quietly. "And yet she did. The bell was rung, not to warn, but to assert control, your control over the narrative. But no one's narrative remains unchecked when logic, observation, and conscience converge." Hargreaves' shoulders slumped. The revolver in Melrose's hand no longer mattered. The psychological architecture of the trap had closed. He looked around desperately, seeking an escape from reality itself. Miss Marple stepped closer, almost casually, and spoke in the softest tone of the entire confrontation. "You took advantage of trust, used shadows, mislaid keys, and hidden windows, and in doing so, you created a pattern too intricate for even yourself to remember completely. That is why, Mr. Hargreaves, you are caught, not because you failed in courage, but because you failed in coherence." For a long moment, silence reigned. Then, finally, Hargreaves dropped to his knees, defeated, his voice a trembling whisper. I confess. Everything. It was supposed to be just a warning, but she confronted me." Miss Marple's grey eyes softened, though only slightly. "Yes, and now the story can be told fully, in light rather than shadow." The veiled woman exhaled, relief flooding her features while Ashton sagged against the shed, his terror finally easing. Melrose lowered his revolver, muscles slackening in exhaustion and awe. Miss Marple, as always, remained poised, almost otherworldly in her quiet command of events. "Let this serve as a reminder," she said gently, "that the smallest details, the turn of a latch, the misalignment of a clock, the tremor of a voice, often speak more truth than the bravest declarations. And, as ever, justice prefers the company of observation to the company of haste." The sun sank lower behind the trees, the day waning, but in the orchard, clarity reigned at last. The evening deepened around them, the last pale light spilling across the orchard and the churchyard like a faint benediction. Melrose remained tense, though the immediate danger had passed, his eyes darting toward every shadow, every line of hedge, as if expecting the killer to rise again from the soil. The veiled woman, Clara, as Miss Marple had discerned, stood a few paces away, still trembling, but a measure of relief softening the tension in her shoulders. Miss Marple remained in the center of it all, the picture of calm authority. She watched Hargreaves as he was led, hands bound, toward the waiting constables called from the village. Even in defeat, his expression was an uneasy mixture of disbelief and simmering resentment. His carefully constructed web of secrecy undone by observation, deduction, and the quiet insistence of conscience. "Do you understand," Miss Marple said quietly to Hargreaves as he passed, "that your undoing was never a matter of force, but of subtle error? The misplaced footstep, the faint polish, the bell rung too early. All the little mistakes you thought trivial have accumulated like dust in a corner until they became visible." Hargreaves' lips twitched as if he wished to reply, but no words came. Even his habitual smirk seemed to vanish in the sober light of reckoning. Clara approached Miss Marple, voice still quivering. I never thought anyone would understand. He tried to frighten me, make me think I was imagining it all. But you—" She paused, struggling to regain composure. "You saw it. You understood." Miss Marple inclined her head gently. "The human mind reveals much in action, my dear, and those who observe closely may perceive truths invisible to those who act out of fear or impulse. Your courage in listening, in noting, in surviving, has completed the chain of deduction." Melrose exhaled sharply. "I don't know which impresses me more, your composure or the precision with which you unmasked him." She allowed herself the faintest smile. "Both are necessary, Colonel. Precision of mind and steadiness of heart. One without the other serves only chaos." As the constables led Hargreaves down the path toward the village, the first stars appeared in the sky, casting a delicate silver over the darkened orchard. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the church, now silent and still, as though it too had witnessed and approved the final revelation. "Will Ashton be safe now?" Clara asked. Miss Marple considered him, the younger man who had trembled at his own knowledge yet acted with honesty once fear had passed. "Yes," she said, "he will be safe. The truth, when revealed carefully, shields the innocent as well as it exposes the guilty." Clara nodded, her veil fluttering slightly in the breeze. "And the child, the one he protected all these years?" "The child will learn the truth in time," Miss Marple replied softly, her voice carrying both reassurance and the inevitable gravity of circumstance. "But for now, it is enough that the danger has passed, and the manipulator is in custody. The rest will follow step by step in order and with justice." Melrose turned toward Miss Marple, expression a mixture of admiration and mild exasperation. "You make it seem so inevitable, as if it were merely a matter of observation and patience." "Patience," she said, allowing a faint twinkle of irony, "is the quiet detective's most indispensable companion. And observation never lies. It merely waits for the observer to notice." For a long moment they all stood in the orchard, the darkening sky above, the distant lights of the village winking gently, and the weight of revelation settling like a delicate hush over the scene. The shadows had receded. The truths were now plain, the consequences inevitable. Finally, Miss Marple straightened, smoothing her gloves. "Come, Colonel. Let us return to the vicarage. There is still the matter of recording the timeline, ensuring all accounts align. The police will need it documented, and I find that even in triumph, proper procedure is advisable." As they walked back along the gravel path, the air smelled faintly of wet earth and fading flowers, a reminder of both the fragility and resilience of life. Clara followed behind, quieter now, carrying the weight of relief tempered by sorrow. Ashton, still shaken, trailed silently. Miss Marple, as ever, walked at her own pace, the soft rustle of her skirts the only accompaniment to her thoughts. And though the case had reached its conclusion, the quiet satisfaction of logic and justice, and the small, meticulous victories of observation, lingered with her, a private triumph against the disorder of human deceit. By the time they reached the vicarage gates, the night was fully upon them. Stars glimmered faintly through a clear sky, and the estate lay in calm repose, the chaos of revelation already dissolving into orderly resolution. Miss Marple paused, looked back at the orchard, and allowed herself the faintest smile, dry and knowing. "It is remarkable," she murmured to no one in particular, "how often human folly leaves such traceable footprints for those who care to see." And with that, she stepped over the threshold of the vicarage, leaving the night to hold its secrets no longer. Inside the vicarage, the warmth of lamplight spilled across polished wood and neatly stacked hymnals, a stark contrast to the tense, shadowed drama of the orchard outside. Miss Marple settled into an armchair with the ease of someone who had spent a lifetime observing human nature from the periphery, while Melrose, still taut from adrenaline, paced the small sitting room. Clara and Ashton remained near the window, the faint moonlight casting silvery highlights over their anxious faces. Miss Marple regarded them both with quiet satisfaction. "Now that the immediate danger has passed," she said, her voice calm yet laced with that gentle authority which brooked no dispute, "it is essential to reconcile all timelines and testimonies. Even the smallest discrepancy may bear significance, and the police will require an orderly account of events." Melrose exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I must admit, Miss Marple, the clarity with which you expose the chain of events is extraordinary. I feel as though I have been chasing shadows when, all along, you are sketching the pattern in the dark." Miss Marple allowed herself the faintest smile. "Observation and patience, Colonel. One observes quietly, noting the minutiae, the misaligned clock, the misplaced salver, the faint trace of polish on a handrail. And then, when the puzzle begins to cohere, one merely waits for the human element to complete the picture." Clara shifted slightly, her veil brushing against the window frame. "I never imagined that small details, things I thought I hadn't noticed, could make such a difference." "Ah," Miss Marple said softly, "that is always the paradox. Human beings imagine themselves clever, guarding secrets, masking intentions. Yet it is precisely their attempts at concealment that leave the telltale traces. A breath too short, a hand trembling, a bell rung at the wrong moment. These are the clues that reveal truth to a patient observer." Ashton nodded, his earlier terror giving way to quiet contemplation. "I realize now how misguided I was, and how much I underestimated what could be inferred from small signs." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, settling back in her chair, "and you, my dear, have learned a vital lesson in honesty and courage, even if delayed by fear. The child, whose fate was entwined in this web of secrecy, will now learn the truth in due course, safely and with protection." Melrose's gaze wandered toward the door, imagining the constables escorting Hargreaves away. "I suppose the matter of Lady Bantry's fall can finally be laid to rest." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes, and the lesson remains, that human motives, however obscured by fear or malice, are always rooted in the understandable, however grotesque they may appear in execution. There is no magic here, only psychology, circumstance, and the inexorable logic of human action." The clock on the mantel ticked steadily, a reminder of time's impartiality. Outside, the night held a quiet calm, the shadows no longer hiding threat, but simply stretching in the silver moonlight. Melrose, still impressed and humbled, finally allowed himself a dry chuckle. I confess, Miss Marple, that I feel both wiser and foolish in equal measure. Wiser for having witnessed your reasoning, foolish for not seeing it myself." Miss Marple, with the faintest twinkle in her grey eyes, rose slowly, straightening her gloves. "Wisdom, Colonel, is often a matter of attentive observation rather than brilliance. And foolishness, well, it is the inevitable companion of all who imagine themselves above noticing the trivial. Now, let us see that these statements are properly taken, and that the events of this evening are recorded accurately, so that justice may proceed without shadow or confusion." As she led the group in quiet preparation, the vicarage itself seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. The night, which had so recently carried the weight of fear, was now filled with the sober triumph of truth. And for those who had witnessed the unraveling of deception, Miss Marple, Melrose, Clara, and even Ashton, there was the quiet satisfaction that human observation, patience, and careful reasoning had prevailed where violence, secrecy, and malice had once threatened. And so, in the gentle lamplight of the vicarage, the case of Father Mallory's death reached its logical, orderly conclusion, leaving only the lingering acknowledgement of human folly, the precision of deduction, and the enduring authority of one quietly astute observer, whose presence had ensured that even the most carefully concealed secrets could not long remain hidden. The vicarage settled into a profound quiet once the formalities of statement-taking were concluded. Outside, the moonlight draped the gardens in silver, softening the sharp edges of the day's revelations, while within, the household moved with tentative normality. Footsteps careful, voices lowered, as though they were still negotiating the tension between relief and lingering unease. Miss Marple remained seated in the sitting-room, her fingers interlaced over her lap, eyes cast toward the window, yet seeing far more than the dim light and swaying trees. Melrose, standing near the mantel, watched her with a mixture of admiration and bemusement. "I confess, Miss Marple, it is a peculiar pleasure to witness the resolution of such a case with neither fanfare nor tumult, yet with every strand of truth laid bare." She inclined her head lightly. "Peculiar, perhaps, but entirely preferable. Haste and noise rarely reveal the intricate motives and subtleties that govern human behavior. Observe quietly, allow patterns to emerge, and the story tells itself, if one has the patience to read it correctly." Clara, seated near the lamp, adjusted her veil, her hands trembling slightly. "I suppose it is hard to imagine, after all that has happened, that human actions, however cruel, can be so meticulously traced by observation alone." "Precisely," Miss Marple said softly. "And notice, my dear, that it was never the loud declarations nor the overt threats that unraveled the truth. It was the minutiae, footsteps, gestures, misaligned objects, that provided the path from suspicion to certainty. Human error is always more reliable than deception when one knows how to look." Ashton, still pale and subdued, looked from Miss Marple to Melrose. Now I see how wrong I was to attempt concealment. I thought I was protecting someone, and in doing so, I allowed fear to dictate my actions. It is astonishing and humbling how small acts can mislead as effectively as any deliberate plot." Miss Marple inclined her head, a faint, dry smile touching her lips. "Indeed. Yet the lesson is not solely about error or fear, but about attention and conscience. Those who observe with care and act with reason may correct wrongs before they become irreparable." Melrose exhaled slowly, letting the tension of the evening leave him in measured waves. "And what of the child?" he asked, nodding toward the direction of the veiled woman. "Their life has been affected by events beyond comprehension." Miss Marple's gaze softened imperceptibly. "The child will learn the truth in time and under protection. What is essential now is that the forces of secrecy and manipulation have been neutralized. Justice, as it must, moves quietly and steadily. It does not require spectacle." A long silence settled over the room, punctuated only by the gentle ticking of the mantel clock, each stroke a measured echo of order restored. Outside, the night was undisturbed, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the garden. Within, the human elements of fear, relief, and reflection were equally still, held in check by the certainty of resolved truth. Miss Marple finally rose, smoothing her skirts, the faint rustle sounding oddly triumphant in the quiet room. "The evening has concluded its necessary business," she said, her voice carrying calm authority. "It remains for those who wield law and duty to formalize the record, and for those affected to find their own quiet measures of recovery." Melrose inclined his head respectfully. "I have no doubt, Miss Marple, that even as the authorities take charge, the clarity you have provided will ensure that every action taken henceforth is informed, precise, and just." She allowed a moment's pause, glancing toward the hearth, where the fire had dwindled to glowing embers. "Let this, then, be remembered. Human folly leaves traces, small yet significant. Observation paired with reason may untangle even the most cunningly woven deceit. And in such matters, the patient eye and the steady mind are, always, stronger than fear or malice." The room fell into quiet again, a measured, thoughtful hush, as though the house itself absorbed the lessons of the night. Miss Marple, with her usual quiet authority, settled back in her chair, leaving the others to reflect, to learn, and to carry forward the knowledge that even the darkest human impulses could be laid bare by the light of careful attention, reasoning, and the inexorable logic of truth. The vicarage lay in the tender hush of early morning, the first pale light filtering through curtains drawn the night before in apprehension and suspense. The village beyond remained still, as if holding its breath, while within, the household moved with subdued purpose, the quiet restoration of routine following a night of extraordinary disturbance. Miss Marple sat by the window, her gaze drifting over the dew-spangled garden, her hands folded calmly in her lap. The events of the past hours had left their mark, yet she bore no triumphalism, only the serene satisfaction of a task accomplished with precision. Hargreaves was in custody, his web of deceit unraveled, the living parent of the hidden child identified and secured, and Clara, though weary, bore the quiet relief of one who had survived both fear and the weight of secrecy. Ashton, chastened but enlightened, lingered near the hearth, contemplating the moral and practical lessons the ordeal had delivered. Melrose, now more relaxed, poured himself a cup of tea, casting occasional glances toward Miss Marple, both in admiration and in that subtle bewilderment reserved for those whose intellect operates on planes both meticulous and imperceptibly wry. "It is remarkable," he said finally, "how neatly all of this tangle of lies, secrecy, and fear, has resolved itself." Miss Marple allowed herself a faint smile, dry and knowing. "Neatly, Colonel. Yes, but neatness in resolution is seldom the gift of chance. It is the product of observation, patience, and careful inference. The world of human folly may be messy, but truth, pursued quietly and with attention, leaves a very clear trail." Clara approached, the morning light glinting softly against her veil. "And the child, the one Father Mallory protected?" "They will be informed," Miss Marple said simply, in a manner both measured and safe. "There is no haste where truth must be carefully revealed. Fear and panic may destroy. Clarity protects." Melrose shook his head, half in admiration, half in exhaustion. "I dare say, Miss Marple, your methods would humble the cleverest criminal in England." She inclined her head slightly. "I do not seek to humble, Colonel, only to observe and to ensure that the natural consequences of action and error are permitted to unfold in due course. The rest is for others: law, conscience, and human decency." A soft breeze stirred the curtains, carrying the faint scent of wet earth and awakening flowers. The orchard, once the stage of secrets and dread, now seemed simply a garden, serene and ordinary. The echoes of human malice and misjudgment had been contained, the threads of deception untangled. Miss Marple rose at last, stretching her back and smoothing her gloves, ready to step from observation into the calm continuity of her ordinary day. She allowed herself a final, almost imperceptible smile, the faintest acknowledgment of a night that had tested human cunning, fear, and morality, and found each wanting in the face of reason and patience. "Come, Colonel," she said lightly, almost conversationally. "Let us return to our tea. There are always other mysteries, but for now, we may enjoy the simple pleasure of knowing that the truth, however late, has been revealed." Melrose followed, a faint trace of a smile breaking the tension from his features, while Clara and Ashton moved quietly behind. The vicarage settled fully into morning, ordinary once more, its secrets unveiled, its wrongs reconciled, and its household left to the slow, steady rhythm of life resuming. And Miss Marple, always composed, always quietly, observing, allowed herself the private satisfaction of a case concluded, not with spectacle or melodrama, but with the inexorable clarity of logic, the subtle triumph of attention to detail, and the enduring reassurance that, in the end, truth has a habit of revealing itself to those who care to see. The window glowed with the soft morning light, the garden shimmered with dew, and the world outside continued, unknowing yet safer for the careful observation of one quietly resolute woman. The death of Father Mallory had been avenged not by force or accusation, but by the subtle, unwavering power of perception, reasoning, and patience, and for those who had witnessed it, that lesson would linger far longer than the memory of fear. Miss Marple rose, adjusted her hat, and with a dry, knowing remark whispered only to herself, "It is remarkable what a little attention will reveal, and how often men overlook the obvious in pursuit of the extraordinary." And with that, she stepped into the quiet morning, leaving behind a vicarage restored, a village safe, and a mystery laid finally to rest.